Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending part one of our two-part webinar, Israel and Anti-Semitism for Curious Non-Jews. During Operation Guardian of the Walls, the war that lasted for 11 days in May, Hamas was rather successful in making it look like the war they had planned with Iran's help was just righteous rioting because of a real estate dispute. As a result, anti-Semitism dramatically increased worldwide and 250% in the UK specifically. This led to my college friend, Laura Klett, reaching out to me and asking if I wanted to do a webinar on anti-Semitism for non-Jews. And then she ended up doing at least 90% of the work for these two webinars. Laura is a devout Christian who graduated from the University of Maryland in 2020 with a bachelor's and master's in finance and currently works for Freddie Mac, not a Jewish or pro-Israel organization. She is simply a modern day righteous Gentile who saw a need for the Christian community especially, but truly all non-Jews, to be aware of anti-Semitism and the role they can play in stopping it, particularly by learning what's actually happening in Israel. People like Laura give me so much hope for the future. I will now turn it over to her to introduce our speakers.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. Naomi, would you be able to turn the video on, please, by any chance?
Yes, I'm trying.
Anyways, again, that was quite the introduction. So thank you, Naomi. Truly, we are so glad to have just this opportunity for a conversation really on what has been going on over the past year and see it in the context of history and from multiple faiths. So Naomi, she is my friend, very good friend from college as well. And together we just have started this event. And so let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker, David Stone. David is an academic director at StandWithUS UK. He is an educator, speaker, published author, and activist in a range of fields, including public health and geopolitics, and assisted in planning and delivering a public health curriculum in Israel at the new Bar Ilan Medical Facility in Galilee. He will be speaking on the Jewish history of Israel. And so without further ado, David, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good evening from London.
Evening.
It's lovely to be here, albeit in an electronic capacity. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and share screen. So I always have a frisson of anxiety when I try to share the screen. Okay, I think you have to disable the participant screen sharing for me. And then
Hold on one moment.
Okay.
Okay, try again.
Yes, something seems to be happening here. And I'm seeing it on my screen. I hope you're seeing it on yours.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, excellent. Let's get started now. There's going to be a lot of information in these next few minutes. So forgive me if I rush through some of the material. So I'm an epidemiologist. Nowadays I don't need to explain what an epidemiologist is. But you may wonder what an epidemiologist is doing talking about Israel and anti-Semitism. Well, just as we've had and we're still experiencing a horrible pandemic of the coronavirus, we're also experiencing another horrible pandemic, which is of anti-Semitism. And so here I am, having thought I'd retired from my role as an epidemiologist at Glasgow University. Here I am dealing with another epidemic or pandemic, if you like. I'm a volunteer with StandWithUS UK. I officially have the title Academic Director. Okay, this is what I'm planning to cover, these 4 bullet points. And the last one I've added in there because it's connected to the other 3. So I'm going to be looking at the evidence for a Jewish presence and statehood in Israel up to 3,000 years ago, the impact of Jewish re-immigration to Israel on others, that's mainly Arabs, but others as well, in the early 20th century, the position of Arabs in modern Israel, and then finally, how all of these topics relate to what we're seeing in contemporary anti-Semitism. I'm going to start really with a slide I'm going to show you towards the end of the presentation, and which is, what do anti-Zionists say? Well, many of you will be aware of this. It's hard to get away from it. They see that Zionism is a colonialist, a European colonialist movement that falsely claims a Jewish connection to Israel. In other words, it's a European import from around the 19th century. They also see that Zionists, the Zionist immigrants, harmed and ethnically cleansed the native Palestinians, and that today Israel systematically discriminates against Arabs. So you can see the common connection there, the thread of really demonization that runs through this narrative that Zionism is an alien import that has had nothing but a malign influence on the indigenous population, and indeed that attitude has continued right through to modern Israeli politics. So how do we address these allegations? Well, the first thing to say is that Israel is not new. The state of Israel the modern state of Israel was established in 1948, but that was the 3rd Jewish state. There were 2 previous Jewish states, one starting around 1000 before the Common Era, then another one about 500 years later, after the destruction of the first temple, and then the 3rd one was the one that we know today. And there's a nice quote here from Leo Leibovitz, who's an American-Israeli writer, who says, well, you can read it, that the Israelis are the ultimate indigenous survivors, and the Israelis stroke Jews have aboriginal rights in our national homeland, and we should be proud of that and help others to do the same. So this is a key message, that Jews are the aboriginal people of the area that is today called Israel. So a little bit of history now. The Kingdom of Israel was established around 3,000 years ago. And I rather like this, this sentence: had it not been for foreign conquests and expulsions, Israel today would be over 3,000 years old. Now, I've listed there, you don't need to count them, I've listed there 16 foreign conquests. And all of these foreign conquests have been seen off, which makes Zionism the most successful anti-imperialist movement in history. Far from being a colonialist movement, Zionism was a reaction to colonialism and has enabled the indigenous people, the Jewish people, to re-establish sovereignty in their historical homeland. But we have to ask, well, what is the evidence for that? The anti-Zionists say there is no evidence of any Jewish connection to what is called Israel today. Well, is there evidence? The answer is yes. That's the overwhelming consensus among scholars that have looked at this period of history, and they have used 3 main sources to come to that conclusion. Biblical texts, which from an academic, scholarly point of view, are of questionable reliability. I hope that doesn't offend anybody listening to this. but I think we've got to be very hard-headed about it. The biblical texts do provide some pointers, but that is all. The real evidence comes from documentary sources, historical accounts from, for example, Roman historians, and above all from archaeological finds. And there's, I mentioned a couple, the Tel Dan stele and the Mesha stele in the Israel Museum and the Louvre Museum, respectively, have inscriptions which refer to the House of David, to the original ancient Israel. Worth mentioning that the word Jew comes from Judean, the Latin Judaeus, inhabitant of Judea, the southern portion of the Kingdom of Israel. The word Jew and Judean is identical in every language bar English and French. And you can go and visit the forum in Rome and see the Arch of Titus, where you can see evidence before your eyes of Hadrian removing the menorah from the temple that the Romans destroyed. Hadrian expelled or murdered all of the Jews, of the Judeans, if you like, and renamed Judea Syria Palestina after the Philistines, Greek peoples who were the Israelites' enemies. So we're going to fast forward now to the modern era. Just want to make the point that again, we have strong evidence that Jews always remained in the homeland, what Jews called Eretz Israel, despite all of these repeated conquests and expulsions. And we've got, as I say, good evidence for that. Okay, I'm going to move forward now to the 19th century, to the modern Zionist era. I don't have time to dwell on this slide. If you're interested in what you could call proto-Zionism, that is really a kind of Christian evangelistic Zionism, I strongly recommend you to read the novel Daniel Deronda by George Eliot if you haven't read it. Because there you will find a fascinating articulation of the proto-Zionist or Christian Zionist perspective before the Jewish Zionist movement really had launched itself. And Jewish Zionism, authentic Zionism that arose from within the Jewish people, really had to wait for the arrival of some very profound thinkers on this subject. I've mentioned three of them here, but the greatest of them was undoubtedly Theodor Herzl, who not only had this dream of a renewed Jewish state in Israel, but set about putting it into practice. Just very briefly, we keep hearing that Zionism is incompatible with either Arab nationalism or Palestinian nationalism. This isn't true. The Zionists were not anti-Arab. I've quoted here. I'm not going to read it out. You can read these quotations if you like. It's on the screen. David Ben-Gurion was the leader of the socialist Zionist movement. Zev Jabotinsky was the leader of the so-called revisionist, or what people call right-wing Zionists. Left and right don't have quite the same meaning in Zionist or Israeli history as they do in Western countries. But both of these leaders, both on the left of the right, regarded Zionism as something that would actually benefit the Arab peoples of the region as well. And in fact, that support for Arab nationalism as well as Jewish nationalism on the Zionist side was carried through into politics. So here we have Chaim Weizmann, who was the leader of the Zionist movement at the end of the First World War, signing an agreement, he thought, with King Faisal, who was the leader of the Arabs of Palestine at that time, where they both recognized the right of each people to sovereignty in their historical homeland. And unfortunately, Faisal, and probably under peer pressure, walked away from that agreement. But had that agreement held, there would have been no conflict over the last 100 years. That's a poignant moment to reflect on that. Then moving forward a little bit further, I've mentioned that the Zionist attitude to Arabs was in no way anti-Arab or racist or in any way denying the rights of the Arab peoples in the Middle East. That was in stark contrast to the attitude of the local Arab leadership. The leader of the Palestinian Arabs, they didn't call themselves that at the time, They were really Syrian Arabs because the district of Palestine was part of southern Syria within the Ottoman Empire. But the leader of the Arabs of Palestine was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was an ally of Hitler and a notorious anti-Semite. So he was no friend of Zionism, and yet in his evidence to the British Peel Commission in 1937, you can look it up, you can read this stuff, the evidence is all there. He made it very clear that the allegations that we've heard down the decades were simply untrue. Zionists did not steal Arab land. There were no Arab communities that were wiped out by the Zionists, and that the land was purchased legally, mainly from absentee Arab landowners. And he also made the point that the quality of life of Palestine's Arabs had vastly improved as a result of both the British Mandate and Jewish immigration. If we fast forward now to the war of 1947 to 49, Israel's war of independence, again, it's claimed by anti-Zionists and indeed by some Israeli revisionist historians, so-called different kind of revisionists from the Jabotinsky types. By revisionist, I mean they were challenging what they regarded as the accepted Israeli narrative. Benny Morris was one of these revisionist historians who argued originally that there had indeed been ethnic cleansing of the Arab population by the Zionist forces. He recanted that subsequently. And in fact, he ended up agreeing with Azam Pasha, the Secretary General of the Arab League, that the flight of the Palestinian Arabs was the direct result of a failed war of extermination and massacre directed at the Jews. So there's some interesting agreement there that this allegation of ethnic cleansing simply is not borne out by the evidence. Now, you often hear it said that Israeli leaders have no interest in the plight of the Palestinians or empathy for the Palestinians. The evidence suggests quite the opposite. There have been multiple offers of peace. I mentioned the Weizmann-Faisal agreement, which was rejected by the Arabs. That carried right through. The Peel Commission produced a partition plan that would have awarded the Palestinians a state side by side with a Jewish state. That was rejected. 1947, the UN proposed the same thing, rejected by the Arabs, and all the way up to just last year, the Trump plan that would have offered the Palestinians a state that the Israelis accepted, at least as the basis for negotiation. I'm not going to go through all these bullet points because I just don't have time, but I would draw your attention to the fact that, contrary to what is often said, when Israel was in charge of the territories in the West Bank and Gaza, the efforts to improve Palestinian Arab welfare were quite extraordinary. And I investigated this myself and have published an article in Fathom Journal about this, about the improvement of Palestinian health between 1967 and 95. What about the plight of, or the position of Arabs in Israel today? Well, it's very important, I think, to recognize that all Israeli citizens, regardless of ethnicity or religion or background, have these rights, which I won't read out. You can read them on the screen. And there's no doubt at all that Israel is the freest country. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. According to Freedom House, which is a Washington-based NGO, it's by far the freest country in the Middle East. And all of these civil rights are enshrined in law. So does Israel discriminate against its Arab citizens? So as I've already said, no, they don't. The Arabs enjoy exactly the same civil and legal rights as Jews. Are there other forms of discrimination? Well, as in all countries, yes, minorities do suffer a degree of discrimination. And there's no doubt at all that there is more poverty within the Arab sector than in the Jewish sector within Israel. But it's worth pointing out here that the poorest sector of Israeli society is not the Arab sector, it's Haredi Jews. They have been found in repeated surveys to be the poorest sector of the Israeli population. The Arabs not far behind them on the poverty scale, and both of these communities are culturally conservative. So, for example, Arab women tend not to be permitted to go out to work, although that is gradually changing. And we know that Haredi Jews are very often reluctant to join the mainstream workforce. And again, that is changing, and that there are some connections between the lack of IDF service, because both of these communities are not required to serve in the Israeli army, although interestingly enough, this is an issue that the current Israeli government is grappling with, and the law is likely to change very soon on that front. You'll often hear allegations that Prime Minister Netanyahu was especially anti-Arab. This is complete nonsense. Under his leadership in 2015, the government launched a 5-year economic plan designed to close the economic gaps between Jews and Arabs. This was Resolution 922. If you think I'm making this up, you can look up the report, the evaluation by researchers from the Harvard Kennedy School in 2018. And I've just reproduced a couple of their slides there, which shows that closing gap in education between Arabic speakers and Hebrew speakers, i.e. Arabs and Jews. And there's abundant evidence that this major economic investment is paying dividends in terms of achievement. One of the things that most Arab Israelis are very well aware of is that their life expectancy is the highest in the Arab world or in the wider Muslim world. And when asked if they would prefer to live in an Arab country or in Israel, the vast majority of Israeli Arabs say they want to live in Israel. So back to the slide I started with. This is what the anti-Zionists say, to remind you that Zionism is a European colonialist movement. It isn't. Zionism is an anti-colonialist movement, which has enabled the indigenous people to return to their historical homeland. They say that Zionists have harmed and ethnically cleansed the native Palestinians. This is not true. Zionism actually brought many benefits to the local population, and that was acknowledged even by the most virulently anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic Palestinian leaders. And this allegation that Israel systematically discriminates against Israeli Arabs is equally false, as I've shown you with the data that I've presented. And this kind of false allegation is one of what Natan Sharansky has described. Sharansky, for those who may not know the name, was a dissident in the Soviet Union, became an Israeli politician, and he coined this notion of the 3 Ds to identify when criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism. The 3 Ds being demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. And what we see here is demonization, which according to the IRA definition, that's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which is the most widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism today. These kinds of statements are blatantly anti-Semitic. Just about to finish now. I love showing this slide, just focusing on the issue of whether Zionism is a colonial enterprise. This is what I call my Where's Wally slide. I think probably in the States you call it Where's Waldo. Certainly my kids used to love that book where you had to find that little character. And there were so many people crowded onto the pages that you had difficulty finding them. This is my Where's Wally or Where's Waldo page. It's really, really hard to find Israel on a map. It's so tiny when you look at the Middle East and North Africa. The area in red are Arab and Muslim countries. That tiny little yellow arrow, yet that black arrow pointing to a little yellow spot is Israel. So this is absurd to call Zionism a colonial enterprise. That's it. I hope I've kept to my time slot. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at dhstone2, or to check out my blog. You can just Google IsraProf at Blogspot. And if any students are thinking of coming to the UK in the coming academic term, please contact StandWithUS UK. We have something called the Emerson Fellowship, which is modeled on the American model you may well have heard about, but we'd be delighted to see you here in the UK if you're thinking of doing that. That's it. Thank you very much. And back to is it Laura, I think? Laura.
That's Perfect. Thank you so much, David. That was a very insightful and very wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Now I have to
Um, so, and at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So our next speaker today is Lydia Yazzie. Lydia is BDS Task Force Coordinator and Campus Regional Field Coordinator at Christians United for Israel. Lydia hopes to inspire Christian college students to be a strong and confident voice for Israel. She earned her bachelor's in political science and minor in Jewish studies at the University of California, Davis. So Lydia, welcome.
Thank you, Laura. It's so nice to be on this with you.
It is very nice to do this with you as well. So we'll have a bit of a Q&A session today with Lydia. And so remind me if I'm wrong, but you're in the Texas area right now, is that right?
So actually, KUFI's national office is in Texas, San Antonio, but actually I live in Montana. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. So we will talk, during the session, we'll talk a bit about how Christians are connected to Israel and just the overwhelming support they do and continue to strengthen over this time period. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So Lydia, what does the Christian connection to Israel look like and why?
Yeah, I would say the Christian connection to Israel, well, multifaceted for sure. Obviously, Israel itself is where Jesus walked, our Christian faith started. So a lot of Christians want to go and see it for themselves in our holy sites, and Israel upholds that. But I would say a lot of our connection is just in the why do Christians support Israel? And that's also multifaceted. And I want to say first and foremost, though, that we are very much like promise-based, not prophecy-based. It's not at all about some prophecies we're trying that people think are in the Bible that you want to get fulfilled or something. We're all about promise-based, what we see in the Bible. I believe that God, from the creation to all the way here, he's in the process of restoring the world, the restoration of all things. And God in Genesis 12 chose a man named Abraham. Well, Abram, and then he put the name Abraham, putting his name on him. And he chose a people through whom I believe he said he would reveal his character. And it is through Israel that we see God is a covenant keeping God, because God made a covenant with Abraham and then with Isaac and then with Jacob to the rest of that land, that he was going to be their God forever. And to me, that means that he stamped his name and he stamped his reputation on something. And I believe I got to look at that. If that's what I'm seeing, then I have to pay attention to that, I believe. But it's not like he made some contract that we like to break easily in America, like signing a car lease and being like, oh, just kidding, not going to pay this month's rent. He signed an actual everlasting covenant in, Genesis 15. I know you're Christian too, so I know you've read it as well. That, God put Abraham to sleep, and Abraham had made a path with two animals, the blood in between. And back in that time, two men walked towards each other through that with a covenant. As they made that covenant, they would say, so be to me, as to these animals, if I break this covenant, meaning death come upon me. But not only did Abraham not walk through that, only God walked through that. And that means that God himself made an everlasting unconditional covenant, and Abraham, it wasn't conditional upon him or his behavior. Not that our behavior doesn't matter, obviously, but God was going to make something eternal with him. And so to me, I have to pay attention to that, because I believe that is important if God is staking his claim and reputation on something. And then I believe that the early church saw this as well. Jesus himself said when he came, he didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets and to start something new. He came to fulfill them. And Christianity is based off of Judaism. We are grateful to the Jewish people for the entire, what we call the Old Testament, for the patriarchs of the faith, for the prophets, for, all of our scriptures. Well, at least the Old Testament scriptures. And, even for Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, they're all Jewish. And so that's a big part of our faith as well. We believe too about being, grafted in, that it's this story that God has woven, and we've just been grafted into it as Christians. It says in Romans, God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew in Romans. He has a plan. And there's sadly this thing called replacement theology coming into churches, which claims falsely that God has stripped all his promises away from the Jewish people. Only the church matters now, and only the church, is what is important. And it's only Christians that God cares about in that sense, and that God has given his promises to, which I think is a major theological flaw for us, because if God can strip away a promise that he made forever to the people group, that means he can't keep his promises. And that means, how do I know all his promises that he's made to me, he'll keep as well? So I think it's a security of salvation issue as well. It's a deep theological problem. So those are just some of the reasons that it is, and just seeing the faithfulness of God with what he's done, it strengthens my faith.
That's very great. That's great. So it sounds like there's just a lot of promised connections, and just a lot of gratitude and appreciation for the country, because it seems like it's a guiding light to people who are of Christian faith.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's really exciting. And so from your perspective, Lydia, as someone who collaborates with a lot of people who are like younger, what do you see that young students can do, whether they're students or just starting off in their profession? What do you think that they can do to show their support and share their support for the country?
Yeah, I think, realizing it's not a Jewish only issue. You have a voice in this, even if you're not Jewish. You could stand up for what is right, even if you're not Jewish, which is something I had to wrestle with. I was like, well, I don't have any ethnic or heritage claim to this. Why does it matter? But just going to Israel would be an amazing thing to do. As a Christian, I am so grateful that Israel respects all the Christian holy sites, respects Christians' right to worship, and everybody else's as well. But, in the Middle East, that's not something that a lot of my other Christian friends have, sadly, in a lot of the rest of the parts there. And Israel is one of those places. So just educating yourself about who Israel it really is, first and foremost, but then speaking out, whether you know a lot or a little, and you could keep growing, but not being afraid to speak out. And of course, you can always join KUFI. We're over 10 million members, actually. And we're definitely the largest Christian organization out there. And we have a lot of materials that you can, glean from. And we have a very strong voice in DC with the US-Israel relationship, if you want to learn more about that, with legislation we pass yearly and help to pass yearly. We have a diverse activists on campuses from every race, from every church denomination, from every political party that's involved. So it's truly Christians united for Israel. We don't care about your background in other ways. We just want, if we agree on that Jewish people have the right to self-determination, you want to stand against anti-Semitism, and you want to make sure that your church is preaching the right thing when it comes to Israel, then yeah, great, you're in. And, just having prayer groups together. We have a lot of campaigns, especially for college activists on campuses, with a diverse amount of campaigns to look at all aspects of Israel, who Israel really is, the heart behind Israel. So yeah, I would say, you could join KUFI, go to Israel yourself, educate yourself, and then get active in your community, speaking out at your church, speaking out, just knowing the local Jewish community. Do you have any Jewish friends? Maybe go and ask them their experiences, reaching out to them as well, building those Jewish-Christian relations as well. And, posting on social media what you learn, and making sure that there's another voice out there on social media too.
That's very, very great advice. And I think just encouraging the Christians to have a voice and to use it in a beneficial way, just to connect and to build bridges with the community. So that's very inspiring, Lydia. So there are a few points that I know you wanted to touch on. And so would you like to speak a bit about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Israel?
Yeah, sure. Yes. I think first, just to define each in a sense, anti-Semitism basically is hatred of Jewish people. Obviously, you could go to the IRA definition, as David said. It's an incredible definition of anti-Semitism. I guess I could just read it here. It says, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish people or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community, institutions, and religious facilities. So that's kind of just that broad overview, but really anti-Semitism is that, like, hatred of Jewish people. And then I would say anti-Zionism specifically is the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination. Oh, thank you, Naomi. I see you posted it there. They have 11 great examples of what anti-Semitism can look like as well. So I'd recommend you read that definition. But anti-Zionism is simply not allowing the Jewish people to have the right to self-determination and live in their own indigenous homeland. And then, you know, anti-Israel is pretty much denying that as well. I mean, you could be critical of Israel. That's one thing, as long as it's within the rights. But if you're putting a double standard upon Israel that you're not putting upon any other nation, then I have a problem with that. Because why are you singling out Israel only? That seems a little anti-Semitic to me. And I think the importance to know the difference is because also they can be very similar. You'll hear often on college campuses a lie that, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. Like, yeah, I support the right for Jewish people to worship freely or whatever, or be in America, but, you know, I'm just anti-Zionist. And that's not true at all, because actually in that IRA definition, if you're an anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite, because again, why are you only singling out the Jewish people for not having a right to their historical homeland? Actually, the Jewish people have a huge victory story for indigenous people groups all over the world, that they were oppressed for thousands of years and that they're able to overcome that and come back, not only have a presence in their land the whole time, but come back and restore a nation as it once was. And it's a victory story for people groups across the world, and should actually be upheld and treasured and shouted from the rooftops. I think that that's possible, and that people groups can have their own right to self-determination, which is a beautiful thing. So I think that's deeply flawed. And I think that's why you need to know some of the terminology there. If you're an anti-Zionist, you are most likely an anti-Semite as well.
So I guess, were there any additional things that you wanted to say, just in terms of, you know, just speaking to the broader community, kind of all religions, and just kind of like to the broader community as well?
Yeah, I would just say, regardless of your religion, standing up against anti-Semitism is so important. In a lot of societies, we've seen that once we allow anti-Semitism into our society, we allow a lot of other forms of discrimination and racism. So it's really a gateway that we have to guard strongly, I believe, for our freedom for all people. And you do have a voice. You have a strong voice, especially if you live in a democracy of any kind. You live and you have a very strong voice, like us in America, passing legislation, voting for your elected officials, calling them and asking them to vote on these important pieces of legislation that continue to fight anti-Semitism or uphold maybe a good relationship with Israel, or different ways like that. And then also on social media, how the influence that we have of, again, any race, any religion, anything like that, to be able to speak out in one voice for Israel is so important. And actually non-Jewish voices are extremely important in this fight, because then you can't be called quote unquote biased, that just because you're Jewish, of course you have to support Israel. You could come to it from a very factual presentation too, being like, yeah, I have no ethnic ties to this, but I still support it because it's the right thing to do. I stand against hatred. I stand against anti-Semitism, and Israel is a wonderful democracy that should be an example to the world. And it is an example to the world, and you shouldn't lie about a people group like that. So, you know, I think just for the right morals in general.
Oh, Lydia. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, so that's definitely like a vision that I share. Just that truly the voice of speaking in support of Israel would be a normal thing for the broader community, and that you know, the different groups of people that I'm personally connected with would it would be on the forefront of their mind. And I think really it's a matter of having Israel be at the forefront of people's minds, because it really is a very important topic. So
Yeah.
I really love what you mentioned, what you said, Lydia, and thank you so much for joining our panel.
Yeah, thanks for letting me.
Yeah. So and this is Lydia from Christians United for Israel. There you go. So we will move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Haras Rafiq. Welcome, Haras. He is a trustee at Muslims Against Antisemitism. Hello, Haras. He was the CEO of Quilliam International, based in London in the United States for 5 years, and was formerly a member of the UK government task force looking to counter extremism. Ross is also a peer mentor for IDEA, advising regional government agencies. So Ross, we're really excited to hear your perspective from your work with Muslims Against Antisemitism, as well as some of the work you've done against extremism. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hi, Laura. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
But you can't see me?
Let's see.
Does it matter?
Naomi, would you be able to put on Haras's screen, please?
Yes, let me try.
Thank you.
So I'll just start anyway, and then hopefully. Oh, okay. I said okay, and can you see me now? Yeah.
Yes, you're good.
Oh, great. Hi. Thank you for inviting me to speak and present at this event this evening. It's I think it's 11:15 in the evening, and I've got my cup of coffee, so I shall fuel myself up.
You are a champion.
As you mentioned,
thank you for joining.
No, that's it. It's my pleasure. As you mentioned, I was the chief exec of an organization called Quilliam for 7 years, and it was the world's first counter-extremism organization, think tank, and then organization. And we did a whole bunch of different things. From originally about 15, 16 years ago, I was one of the people that wrote what you guys might know as the CBE strategy, the Countering Violence Extremism strategy, and a whole bunch of other things to de-radicalization and rehabilitation of Islamist convicted terrorists. I'm also a director of an organization called ISGAP, which is the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I recently started. I have been a fellow there for about 10 or 11 years. One of the things that ISGAP is well known for is that it discovered over $3 billion worth of undocumented Muslim Brotherhood money that had gone into American universities. And since then, it triggered a federal investigation, and there have been probably in excess of about 6 or 7 billion, and it's ongoing. And more recently, as you mentioned, I'm a trustee of an organization called Muslims Against Antisemitism, which was set up last year as a charity, and it's a new charity, and we've already established a sister organization in North America, and we're looking to do the same around the world. So what I want to talk about today is why it's important for me as a Muslim to tackle anti-Semitism. I also want to touch on what we call the triple threat, talk about the BDS boycott divestment sanctions, look at why the BDS initiative as a whole is anti-Semitic, and I just want to put a bit more flesh, I guess, on the bone of what some of the other two speakers have been talking about. Touch on the Abraham Accords, and then again, I wasn't going to end, but I'll end just on a couple of pieces of theology from mainstream traditional classical Islam, the Quran and Hadith. So Muslims Against Anti-Semitism was set up in the UK, as I mentioned last year, to really challenge the growing anti-Semitism that has been on the increase for over the last 20, 30 years, certainly in the UK and in the US and around the Western world. I remember in 2009, I presented at the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism in Jerusalem, where I posed a question. Actually, it was a two-part. It was a statement and then a question. The statement was that anti-Semitism is not in the DNA of Islam, but it is in the DNA of Islamism. And for me, Islamism is a distinct political ideology. in the same way that there's a difference between social and socialism. Social is the way we're being social, the way we may interact with each other, and socialism is a distinct political ideology that has to be left of center. Islam is a faith practiced by nearly 2 billion people around the world in so many different ways. Quite often, one sect will call the other one a kafir, a non-Muslim, etc. But it's still Islam. And Islamism is a distinct political ideology that wants three things. One is to set up a utopian Islamist state and enforce a version of fiqh. By the way, there's no such thing as Sharia law. It doesn't exist. And I can go into that. That's a lecture in itself. The word qanun in Arabic or law does not exist in the Quran, nor does it exist in the Hadith. But there is fiqh, jurisprudence. So it wants to enforce a state and enforce a particular version of interpretation of jurisprudence on all of its citizens. Secondly, to spread it around the world until it conquers everywhere. And the third thing it wants to do is to wipe Israel off the map. That was my first statement. And the question I posed was, this was in 2009, is anti-Semitism becoming the default position amongst Muslims under the age of 40 in the West? It was a question I posed. I didn't have the data, I didn't have any evidence, but I posed the question. I'm going back to Jerusalem next week and I'm presenting at the same forum, Global Forum Combating Anti-Semitism, on the 14th of July next week. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. But what I will say is that anti-Semitism is now definitely becoming the default. And in fact, it is the default position amongst Muslims, because Muslims are being told around the world for political reasons, and I'll come on to that in a minute, why they're political reasons, that is their theological duty to actually be anti-Semitic, wipe Israel off the map. And if they don't follow this, if they don't follow these tenets, that these reconstructed contemporary tenets, mainly originally, as David mentioned, by Mufti Husseini, because anti-Semitism was imported into the Middle East from Europe at the time. He spread it around the world through the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations. It really doesn't exist in the scripture, in the theology. In fact, you can't be a Muslim unless you recognize the legitimacy of the Torah, the Old Testament, the Injil, the Bible, and other books as well. So what is going on? Well, before I come on to that, there is something, just to prove the point that I was saying, that there is something which traditional classical Islamic scholars have always used, and that's the concept of Israeliyat. And that comes from the Hadith, and the Hadith is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which was said over 1400 years ago by him, where he said in Arabic, Haddatu anhum wala haraj. Narrate from them, and he was talking about Jews, Christians, and others, narrate from them from which there is no harm. And from that, traditional classical scholars actually extrapolated the whole concept of Israeliyat, where there were many things that were taken from the practices of the Jewish diaspora at the time and built into Islamic theology. So really, you can't, on the one hand, take from Judaism and on the other hand, be anti-Semitic. It's just an oxymoron. However, for political reasons, the Islamists and people who have vested interest in the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza and the West, not so much the West Bank these days, really it's a manipulation of a grievance-based theological argument that has now become doctrine amongst, I would say, even the mainstream Muslim or Islamic scholars around the world who don't want to actually think about what traditional classical Islam says, and they're trying to reinvent Islam in a modern context, like the Muslim Brotherhood have done, like the Jamaat Islami and many other offshoots. So if we believe that anti-Semitism doesn't exist within traditional classical Islam, what is going on? Well, what's really going on is something what we call the triple threat. And the triple threat is where anti-Semitism exists from the far left, from the far right, and from Islamist theocrats. And if you look at the common, if you use a Lord of the Rings analogy for any of the audience out there that actually read the books or seen the films, the one ring, there are many rings in Lord of the Rings, but the one ring that binds all three is the hatred of the Jewish or of a Jewish person, and the desire to wipe Israel off the map. That's something that we've seen in Europe in the 1930s onwards, the hatred of Jews and we've seen the genocide, but we saw it. We're starting to see it, and we have been starting to see it since the 1930s in the Middle East, in the Islamist organizations. But now we're seeing it a lot more on what I call the far left or the regressive left, but it's creeping to more sort of slightly left of center left as well. And it's this strange alliance between the three that actually is driving the way for the PR campaigns that we've seen recently, when we saw the conflict a couple of months ago, that's really changing the public perception of who Israel is and what Israel stands for. And one of the ways that it's changed this is, I mentioned the BDS campaigns, and that's the boycott, divestment, sanctions. And that is the desire or the policy, or the desire to enforce policies for countries and individuals to actually stop buying for Israeli products, to actually boycott Israel, boycott trade, etc., etc. And what's really interesting is, as somebody who, a child of the 60s and then grew up in the 70s and 80s, I remember the anti-South African, anti-apartheid campaigns, where the boycott BDS campaigns did work. And I remember going to marches, and I remember people identifying South Africa as an apartheid, as a racist apartheid state, and actually boycotting when it came to sport, when it came to trade, and a whole bunch of other things. And it's this desire and this policy to try and compare Israel to the South Africa of the 70s and the 80s, and this campaign that actually is what's been driving the BDS campaigns, but also you'll see people on social media and even academics, pseudo-academics in my opinion, in some cases, who are more activists rather than academics, they will actually start calling Israel an apartheid state and come out with a whole bunch of fake news and not doing their due diligence. It's because they bought into this whole narrative that Israel is a racist apartheid state, and what they realize, or rather what they try to compare it with, and the decision and the conclusion they've made in their own minds, is that there's a comparison between Israel and South Africa. And this is really interesting, because the main point isn't to criticize Israel's policies or whoever the government is in Israel at the time, but it's really to delegitimize the right of the state of Israel to exist. And that's what's really driving these campaigns. And that's the phenomenon that we're seeing now. And when people say they are anti-Zionist, as has been mentioned before, what they really mean in the majority of cases is that they don't recognize the right of Israel as a state to exist. So why is this anti-Semitic? Well, we could go into the IRA definitions, but from a simple layman's perspective, there isn't any consistency, because if these people are willing to go on the record, to go on marches and protests, etc., to campaign and protest against Israel and to take part and promote BDS campaigns, why aren't they doing the same for another state? And that's the state where my family comes from. They migrated from India to Pakistan, and in the 50s, my father came to the UK. Why aren't they doing the same things, protesting against Pakistan because of their treatment of Ahmadiyas? You can't actually be, in fact, if I ever wanted a Pakistani dual nationality, I would have to sign a piece of paper that actually says a declaration that I agree that Ahmadiyas are not Muslims and they deserve second-class rights in Pakistan. Why aren't these people protesting against Pakistan? Secondly, why aren't they protesting against China and their treatments against the Uyghurs? We saw thousands of people marching in London. In fact, some people say 100,000. I don't know the true numbers, but we also saw many, many thousands, tens of thousands up and down the country in the UK. We've seen them in the US, we've seen them in Canada as well. But there was a march last week outside, or a protest last week outside the Chinese embassy in London, and there were only maybe a couple of hundred people there. Why aren't the same people that are claiming that Israel is an apartheid, racist, xenophobic state that treats Arabs as second-class citizens doing the same thing when it comes to China and Pakistan and many, many other countries? The reality is they're doing it against Israel because it's a Jewish state. And that's why this is anti-Semitic. Another really interesting thing is that we saw the conflict and we saw the thousands of missiles that were fired from Gaza towards Israel, and then the retaliation, and based on the right to defend itself that Israel has, that any sovereign nation has. We saw a lot of protest and we saw a lot of money being spent. But what's really interesting is it's come just shortly after the neighbors, I'm talking about the UAE, I'm talking about Bahrain and many others, have actually made peace with Israel. So what's interesting is that this conflict took place, money was spent, missiles were fired, then Israel's neighbors are making peace. But in actual fact, Iran has been probably paying for the missiles and the war and the conflict that's just taken place recently. And all that'll happen is that they fired their rockets, a ceasefire has happened, and Iran will probably pump in lots of other money and carry on going, and then we'll see another round in God knows when. But these Abraham Accords that have been signed really have a lot of benefits for the neighbors. It's a desire for peace. There are financial benefits, there are trade benefits, there are military benefits, there's health benefits. But the one key thing in my opinion that's been driving these peace treaties and these treaties to recognize Israel is that Israel and these other countries, the neighbors, share a common enemy, and that's Iran. And Iran has made huge amounts of overtures to wanting to claim that they'll bomb Israel and they'll do this, they'll do that. But they also want to go into other countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, into Mecca and Medina, etc., etc. So it's really focused on a common enemy with a whole bunch of other benefits. So I think that this will only grow. I think that what we'll see is that around the world, we will continue to see protests. We will see a whole range of new, because this time it feels different. I remember conflicts in the past, and whenever there's been a ceasefire, people tend to forget and people tend to go on to other things and move on, but driven by social media and this political desire from the far left, the far right, and Islamist theocrats, and many others as well. I see this as what I call another Bosnia moment. And for me, Bosnia in the UK was one of the key moments when radicalization just increased exponentially, and we saw Islamist terrorists because they saw this all these images, and we didn't have social media then. It was on VHS videos, it was in magazines, it was on the news that Muslims were being killed, and there was this perception that nobody was doing anything about it, and many Muslims decided that they wanted to, and then there were theological arguments as to why they should become jihadists, etc. What worries me is that with this drive on social media, with this desire to keep this this perception of Israel and this desire to wipe Israel off the map and this anti-Semitism, this will continue. And what worries me is that this will breed a whole new generation of jihadists who won't be focused initially on setting up a utopian Islamist caliphate somewhere, but they will believe that they are actually in God's gang, in inverted commas, and they are standing up for what they regard as their Muslim brothers and sisters, and they have to fight for what is called a waqf. And a waqf is their claim that the whole land, Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, is actually Muslim land, and once Muslim land, actually from a theological perspective, has been Muslim land. It is ever conquered. It's their Islamic duty to reconquer it, and this is all a whole lot of nonsense, because in traditional classical Islam, as long as one person is allowed to, in any country, practice their faith, and by their faith, I mean they're able to do the 5 pillars, which is read their prayers, eat their food, be able to travel to pilgrimage, etc., then that is what's called in Arabic Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam. And Israel is Dar al-Islam, as are the overwhelming majority of countries in the world. One can argue that there are some countries in the Middle East where Muslims aren't allowed to practice their faith the way they want to. Certain Muslims, that's not Dar al-Islam, but that again is another lecture. I won't go into sort of what we can do now. I'll save that to for some of the Q&A. But I just want to end on a couple of, I guess, a bit of theology from the Quran, and then another saying as well. So why am I somebody who, as a Muslim who has ijazas in fiqh and jurisprudence, and sort of is regarded as somebody who has permission to teach even theology and tasawwuf and spirituality, etc. as well? Why am I somebody who defends the right of Israel to exist? Well, one of the answers, there are many, but one of the answers can be found in Surah Imran, which is one of the chapters in the Quran. It's chapter Imran, and I'll paraphrase. I won't quote it directly, because sometimes if you quote in directly, it can lose a lot in translation. But essentially, what Surah Imran says in one of the verses is that God promised the children of Israel their own land. And for many reasons, and this is where I'm paraphrasing, they didn't behave or didn't agree or whatever, they disobeyed, etc., and God dispersed them around the world. But God doesn't, and this touches on the theme that's been mentioned before, but God does not break his promises. Therefore, God will keep his promise and return the children of Israel to the land of Israel and give it to them before the end of times. And the end of times can be a period that lasts in Islamic theology, thousands of years, hundreds of years, tens of years, whatever. Only God knows what that is. So the Quran is actually saying that God has promised the land of Israel to the children of Israel. And God said that 1400 years ago, when the Quran was revealed, that God will bring them back and give it to them, because God doesn't break his promises. So that is something that anybody who, from a theological perspective, who's a Muslim, actually says, well, this is Muslim land, it doesn't belong to Jews, etc., etc. Just point them to this verse in Surah Imran, and I'm happy to send this verse to you later on. I didn't write down which verse it is, but the chapter is Imran. The final thing is why it's important for me to stand up against any form of xenophobia, whether it's I don't, by the way, we don't use the word Islamophobia, and I've written essays on this. I live in a liberal secular democracy in the UK. Islam is a set of values, a set of ideas. You can, and many people practice Islam very differently, as I mentioned. And I happen to practice a particular interpretation of Islam. In a liberal secular democracy, no set of ideas or values should be beyond critique, legitimate critique. However, no individual should be beneath dignity. So we use the term anti-Muslim hatred. So why am I somebody who stands against anti-Muslim hatred, extremism, terrorism? And that can range from running assets in Syria and Iraq, countering ISIS on the ground, to de-radicalization, rehabilitation, standing up for people, my Jewish brethren, standing up for people who are Christian, even people who have no faith. Well, another saying is really from the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, son-in-law and cousin, and that's the third Caliph, Imam Ali, third ruler. And he basically said that we are all brothers and sisters in faith. If not, at the very least, we are all partners of humanity. And that is something that drives Muslims against anti-Semitism to do what we do. And I'll stop that.
Well, thank you very much, Ross, for sharing about Muslims against anti-Semitism, as well as your perspective of the support for Israel and the stand against anti-Semitism. Very well said. And thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful trip when you're in Jerusalem. I think you said next week. So
It is, yeah, next week.
So now we will move to our two speakers. We have Matthew Garces, Senior Mid-Atlantic Campus Coordinator at StandWithUS, as well as Nathan Altschuler, Senior Mid-Atlantic High School Coordinator at StandWithUS. So I'll do both introductions at the same time. They'll be both sharing about what they do and how they encourage the young generation to stand for Israel and stand against anti-Semitism. So Matthew Garces is Senior Mid-Atlantic Campus Coordinator at StandWithUS. He graduated from the University of Georgia with a degree in International Affairs and Political Science and a minor in French, where he participated with the Follows Project and reestablished the Christians United for Israel chapter at UGA, University of Georgia. Welcome, Matthew. Welcome, Matthew. Nathan Altschuler is Senior Mid-Atlantic High School Coordinator at StandWithUS. He served as a paratrooper in the 890th Brigade in the Israeli Defense Forces. Nathan is an experienced guide and coordinator for Olim L'Tavor and worked for the Ministry of Defense in Israeli security sector. He holds a bachelor's in communications and political marketing from the IDC Herzliya, where he completed the Argov Fellows Program in leadership and diplomacy. So Nathan, welcome to you as well, and welcome to you both.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. Nathan and I are really happy to be here. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Laura and Naomi for helping organize this. I think that this is an extremely important issue, especially for the non-Jewish community. As was talked about earlier, I'm actually not Jewish myself, so I came at this from a different angle than most of my Jewish friends. Was very involved with Christians United for Israel in college, and that's obviously how I met Lydia a couple years back, and was able to work at my university alongside my Jewish brothers and sisters on fighting anti-Semitism and to bring that Israel engagement on campus. But right now, as mentioned, I'm the Mid-Atlantic Campus Coordinator. Essentially what that means is I help coordinate all the activities that we do on college campuses in the Mid-Atlantic, which, just to summarize, is from Virginia to Pennsylvania in essence. And essentially, StandWithUS, we do a lot of work to educate about Israel, to fight anti-Semitism, and basically just to support our students and local community members when things get tough. As all of you probably remember, 2 months ago, there were a lot of escalations that happened in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. We saw a spike in anti-Semitism, and StandWithUS was working around the clock to support our students. And also Nathan will talk later, but he works with high school students. And so we essentially work together to ensure that his students are prepared to go to college and my students are prepared for what they will likely experience in college, and hopefully will take what they learn and take it into their careers in the future. But just want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, especially within the space that I work in. A lot of the speakers previously had eloquently talked about what anti-Semitism is, what anti-Zionism is, what the connection is between the two. So I don't feel the need to have to reiterate because every single point that they made was spot on. But essentially, a lot of the forms of anti-Semitism that may exist on college campuses can look anywhere from, we have certain professors who make statements or issue or sign on to petitions that demonize Israel or single out Israel or the Jewish people. Sometimes we'll see academic departments putting out posts or statements in regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We'll sometimes see Jewish or pro-Israel students be treated differently or discriminated in their classes by their peers as a result of their opinions or their identity. And as we all know, Zionism is to many Jewish people an identity point for them. We sometimes see universities scheduling events like graduation and other things on Jewish religious holidays like Shabbat or other holidays, and so on and so forth. So we see a lot of anti-Semitism on campuses, and essentially StandWithUS is there to support our students. And so we really, do our best to help support our students. no matter what their background is, right? We work with Jewish students, we work with Christian students, and so on and so forth. And I think as of late, a lot of us have seen in the last year, as a result of the pandemic, the spike of anti-Semitism, not just on our campuses, but online as well. And that's kind of one of the big touch points that we love to, or not we love to, but we work hard on. Essentially, kind of how do we combat this online hatred, this online bigotry against Israel or the Jewish people. We see that anti-Semitism spikes after escalations in the Middle East. So as I mentioned, 2 months ago, we had the escalations, and as a result, we saw insane amounts of statements. We saw swastikas on campuses. We saw just manifestations, protests. We saw, for example, in New York, there were the anti-Israel rallies that said, we don't want 2 states, we want all of it, essentially signaling their desire to completely obliterate the state of Israel and not seek any form of compromise between Israel and the Palestinians. And I can safely say that all of us here seek a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but unfortunately not everybody believes in that. And so essentially, kind of what a lot of the other speakers talked about was, how do we understand anti-Semitism, and how do we, what can we do about it, right? So I really want to, I'm going to close off with this because then I want Nathan to say his part as well. But there are a couple of things that you can do to get a better sense of what anti-Semitism is and how to combat it. Number one is, if you go to StandWithUS.com, on the top right, there is a part where you can sign up for our newsletter. I think it's extremely important for everybody who wants to learn more to understand what's going on. You have no idea how many times I got people messaging me, my non-Jewish friends, saying, I had no idea anti-Semitism was a thing. I thought anti-Semitism ended after the Holocaust. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. And so our newsletters often talk about the work we're doing, talk about the situations that are going on campuses and in high schools and in our communities. And just to stay up to date and informed about it, our newsletter is a great source for that. Number two, also on StandWithUS.com and the webpage on the top right, there is a button where you can report anti-Semitic incidents. So if you or know anybody who deals with any form of anti-Semitism, whether it be ancient anti-Semitism or it be anti-Zionism or whatever that may be, you can report it to Stand With Us directly, and we will be in contact with you to help you deal with it and help you essentially handle it appropriately. And last but not least, if you're a college student or high school student or whatever it may be, and you want to just be connected to Stand With Us, please be in touch with me. I'm happy to give my email afterwards. I think that the hard part is knowing what to do if you're a college student without any support from your school or from peers, and we're here to help. And with that, I will yield my time and I'll let Nathan give his portion of this part.
Thank you, Matt. First of all, as Matthew said, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Naomi, for arranging this. And thank you to Haras, David, and Lydia. I was texting Matthew and saying how I felt like an attendee. I learned so much. I was really enjoying everything that you guys brought to the table. So again, I'm not going to go back into definition of anti-Semitism and everything you guys spoke so eloquently about. Instead, I'm going to focus on 4 things that young professionals, students, campus, high school can do to combat anti-Semitism. And within those 4 things, I'll talk a little bit about my topic as well. Number 1 is the most obvious, but a lot of people don't do this. It's education. Educate yourself, educate your family, educate your friends about anti-Semitism. So 1, you can identify it. And number 2, you can confront it when it occurs. Now, specifically within the work and the space that I deal with high school students, and Stand With Us, we take a holistic approach. What does that mean? We balance the complicated details with the big picture. And my biggest goal throughout the year is to take the high school students that we have, and we work with a diverse group of high school students, public schools, private schools, Jewish students, Christian students, students from all over the United States. And the approach, we integrate social emotional learning, relationship-centered learning, student-centered active learning, and in specifically what I try to do is use experiential teaching as well. But moreover, we try to build a space where the students feel comfortable to talk about these topics. And as Matthew said, the last 2 months, we saw that a lot of anti-Semitism is coming to the high school students through social media, which are platforms that honestly, I didn't have those when I was in high school. This is a new platform, and we're all learning how to deal with it. And we have to help the students so that when they become young professionals, when they become campus students, when they become parents and adults, they are already prepared to have those nuanced discussions, They are prepared to have those conversations, and they have a toolboxes of resources that they can use. And as Matthew said, they have the phone numbers and the emails to contact if they need not just resources, but someone to talk to about the situations that they see. Number two, tell your story. Be proud of your story. And within this, my parents, Alex and Rosanna, they were born in Moscow in the former Soviet Union. Their birthplace was a country which denied them the right to practice their religion, the right to take charge of their identity, and to speak of their ancestral homeland. My parents chose to fight back against anti-Semitism, and I grew up hearing about this my entire life. And these two individuals, my mother and my father, what did they do? They taught me that sometimes supporting a very significant cause in your life is not an easy or a safe undertaking, but it's the right thing to do. So be proud of your story, claim your story, talk about your story, explain why Israel is important to you, why you're an ally to the Jewish community, why you're working in this space, why you're having these conversations. And honestly, the best example of this, and I was telling this to Matthew as well, is Laura and Naomi. They graduated college and they created a platform where they bring in speakers to their friends. This is exactly what we want to see from our students. If I have a student who finishes high school, finishes college, and continues to be passionate and not just bring resources to her or his friends and family, but to communities and to other groups, this is the most important thing. Number three, if you see or hear something anti-Semitic, take action. And within that, we were going to talk about 3 steps. I have 4 that we talk about with the Center for Combating Anti-Semitism at StandWithUS. Identify, define, expose, and act. And within this, I was actually, David, going to talk about Natan Sharansky, because as the son of Russian immigrants, he is one of the people I grew up with listening about my entire life. He's one of my heroes. And he spoke about the 3 Ds, which we spoke about: demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. So identify it, define it, expose it, and act. Do something about it. And last but not least, and in my opinion, the most important one, which embodies all the other 3 things that I said, is to build relationships and bridges with people who are not specifically in your community. And Lydia touched on this a little bit. Welcome the stranger, attend cultural events, learn about other groups, have conversations. I was telling Matthew that I have, I was studying in Towson at nights for a master's in Jewish education. And one of my classmates is this incredible pastor who lives 15 minutes away from me. And we've never met. And we were talking about our different communities. And it was incredible that both of us needed to educate each other about our communities. And we live so close together. Pick up the phone, or nowadays text, Snapchat, TikTok, whatever the students do, have those conversations, build those relationships, because that is going to be crucial and important. And last but not least, continue attending events like this. It's not easy on a Tuesday afternoon at 6:51 p.m. EST time to log on and learn. It's a lot easier to go grab a burger with a friend. It's easier to turn on Netflix and HBO. It's a lot easier. Log on to these calls, educate yourselves, and after the call, talk about it with your friends and family. Hey, I jumped on this call. Look what I learned. I heard Haras speak. I heard Lydia speak. I heard David speak. I heard Matthew speak. Look what I learned. Let's get into this a little bit more. Let's have those conversations. Those are the 4 things that I thought were the most important. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Naomi. And of course, biggest shout out to my coworker and my friend, Matthew, who it's always a pleasure to share this platform with.
Thank you so much, Matthew and Nathan. Really, really appreciate you all encouraging the community and just to continue connecting, continue to leverage resources like connecting with StandWithUS, and just definitely let this be the launch of communities connecting and standing for Israel and continuing in being educated. So Naomi, would you like to say a few words? I just really want to thank all the speakers. Thank you, David, Lydia, Ross, Matthew, and Nathan for joining us. This has just been a really, really special event, and really, we are sincerely really thankful for this conversation, for this community, and we've recorded it, and we'll definitely be sharing it across our platforms as well.
I would just like to reiterate my thank you. Thank you so much to our speakers and attendees. Remember, there's part 2 tomorrow, same time, but different Zoom link. So I will be emailing everyone after this. You can also check Eventbrite, check Laura's and my Facebook, LinkedIn. It will all be there. So come back and bring a friend. This is also recorded. So once it finishes downloading, I will also send out the recording of this if you'd like to share with your friends or family.
So thank you again. And I believe for the question and answer portion, if someone has questions, we'll go ahead and have you email them to us. I can put my email in the chat. And you guys can feel free to email me any questions you might have, and we can forward them to our speakers for you all to answer some of the questions, because we went a little bit over time. But again, thank you all so much for joining us, and we are just so happy that we were able to host this event and have this conversation on anti-Semitism. So thank you all so much.